Welcome back. Welcome back. So we're still going through Mark. And I thought it'd be cool just to check y'all's memories to do a quick recap. So last week we talked about three things. Does anyone know what the first one was? Has to do with relationships. Divorce, right? We talked about divorce and how God absolutely does not like it. In fact, I would say God hates it. Second thing we talked about, right, when the people were bringing the little kids to Jesus, the disciples rebuked them, and Jesus in turn rebukes the disciples. And so we learned that God really does care about our next generation. And so it's our responsibility to lead them. And finally, we talked about the rich young ruler, and even though in his eyes he adhered to as much of the law as he could have, and he probably would say he adhered to all of it, that's not really what God's looking for, right? He's looking for our heart posture towards him. We also had some questions, and so I'm curious because I want to make sure we're all engaged. The first one that we asked last week was, why do we think marriage is so precious to God? What were some of the things you guys talked about? Do you guys remember? All right. Let's go, Nico. What we talk about?
Well, it's so precious because it's two people bringing their relationship before God and establishing a covenant.
Absolutely. That's right. We took a look at that. I think Genesis 2:24. That was the cross reference there. For the next question, right, we looked at what were some ways that we could actually help lead the next generation, right? We talked about getting involved in youth ministry, right? Helping the kids out in their walks with Jesus. And finally, maybe one more person. You guys remember what we talked about how can we keep our posture humble and have a position of humility in our walks? Do you remember? You weren't here. I don't know why I'm looking at you.
Remembering that we are not good people, but redeemed bad people.
Amen. There we go. There we go. All right, guys. So tonight's passage, we're going to be continuing in Mark chapter 10. We're going to go verses 32 through 52. For the first section, 32 through 34, Joe Bailey, could I get you to read that? For the next section, 35 up to 46, Robbie, could I get you to read that? And I'll take us from 46 to the end of the chapter. So whenever...
Remind me of my...
Yeah, you're 32 through 34.
And they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. And they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. And taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was happening, or what was to happen there, saying, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days he will rise."
James and John, the two sons of Zebedee, come up to Jesus, saying, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" They said to him, "Grant that we may sit, one on your right and one on your left, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?" They said to him, "We are able." And Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink with you, you shall drink, and you shall be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized. But to sit on my right or on my left, this is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." Hearing, the 10 began to feel indignant with James and John. Calling them to himself, Jesus says to them, "You know that these who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and the great men exercise authority over them. But it is not to be this way among you. But whoever wishes to be great among you shall be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many."
Now they came to Jericho. As he went out of Jericho with his disciples and a great multitude, blind Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, sat by the road begging. And when he had heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Then many warned him to be quiet, but he cried out all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." So Jesus stood still and commanded him to be called. Then they called the blind man, saying to him, "Be of good cheer, rise, he is calling you." And throwing aside his garment, he rose and came to Jesus. So Jesus answered and said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "Rabboni, that I may receive my sight." Then Jesus said to him, "Go your way, your faith has made you well." And immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus on the road. Awesome. So kind of similar to last week, we got 3 sections here, right? So Jesus predicts his death. We're talking about the dispute James and John were having amongst one another, the disciples about who would sit at Jesus' right and left hand. And then finally, we have the miracle for blind Bartimaeus. But the first section we're going to go through is Jesus predicting his death. Now, Jesus actually predicts his death 2 other times for a total of 3 across Mark. And it's kind of interesting that every time you look at it, the disciples just don't get it. In fact, if you go to Mark chapter 8, verse 31, this is the time where Peter actually began to take Jesus aside and rebuke him about what he was saying, right? Because in their minds, and we're going to touch on this in just a second, the Messiah coming as a suffering servant was incomprehensible to them. And what this resulted in was actually Jesus rebuking Peter and calling him Satan. And then similarly in chapter 9, verse 31, we also have Jesus predicting his death again, but the text also indicates the disciples don't get it still. And so time and time again, we're seeing the disciples just don't understand the possibility of Jesus coming to die. And so I wanted to kind of explore that for us just a little bit. And I think one possible explanation is that, again, like I said, they had utter misconceptions of what the Messiah came to do. If you go back to chapter 8, verse 29, Jesus asks the disciples, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter responds on behalf of all of them saying, "You're the Christ." Right? So it's like they get Jesus as the Messiah, but they don't understand what his mission is. Right? And I really love this quote from John MacArthur in my study Bible. It says, "Jesus' messianic mission cannot be understood apart from the cross, which the disciples did not yet understand. For them, to have proclaimed Jesus as Messiah at this point in his ministry would have only furthered the misunderstanding that the Messiah was to be a political military deliverer. That's what they thought Jesus was coming to do. The fallout was that the Jewish people, desperate to be rid of the yoke of Rome, would seek to make Jesus king by force." So that begs the question, why did they think that Jesus was coming to be a political military deliverer? Well, one possible explanation is the Davidic covenant. So if we go back all the way to one of my favorite books, 2 Samuel, chapter 7, in these verses here, this is actually God himself promising to David, essentially, that the Messiah is going to come through his lineage. And if you look at the language here, it says, "When your days are fulfilled and you rest with your fathers, I will set up your seed after you, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom." What? "I will be his father, and he shall be my son, and your house and your kingdom shall be established forever. Before you, your throne shall be established." Right? And so this idea that the Messiah who is going to come is going to have to set up some kind of rule, right? And with David, and we'll get into this in a second, his whole life was marked by conquest and fighting battles. That's kind of where this imagery comes from. We also have this really cool prophecy in Micah that says, "But you, Bethlehem, though you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth to me the one to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth are from of old, from everlasting, in the strength of the Lord. For now he shall be great to the ends of the earth." So in their mind, the Messiah is going to have a global rule, global domination. And so putting all that together, again, David was set the example to be the warrior king, but Jesus being king and Messiah means Rome would have to be overthrown, right? So that's what they're looking for here, is someone to take the yoke of these oppressors off of them, right? David's precedent of driving out God's enemies heavily influenced their view of this political military deliverer, and according to Micah, again, the oppressors will be overthrown. There's also some other context here that I think is interesting, right? Israel was, under the rule and the burden of Rome, and then only a century earlier, the Jewish Maccabees had successfully revolted against, I'm not even going to try to say that word, that empire, to restore Jewish independence, and this set the precedent and reinforced the idea that God delivers his people through military uprising, right? So this is some explanation as to why the disciples could not see the suffering servant reason of Jesus' ministry, right? And I think this is actually a really good segue into the second component, right? If Jesus was going to be this world ruler, wouldn't you want to be a bit buddy-buddy with him too, right? And so that's exactly what you see here, right? In light of their misunderstanding, we see the disciples fight for positions of prominence in this supposed regime Christ would bring, right? And the vocal ones here are James and John. One thing I do want to touch on, though, is like we see Jesus referring to cup and baptism, right? Like, what do those things exactly mean? Those are euphemisms for death, right? So essentially, Jesus is asking James and John, like, do you know what you're asking? Like, are you going to go through the same suffering I'm going to go through and die a similar death as me? And they say they are willing, and Jesus prophetically says, indeed, you will, right? You will drink the cup that I'm going to drink. You will be baptized with the same baptism, meaning they both would be martyred, right? And in fact, if you go to Acts, what is that, 12:2, you see that James was one of the first martyrs of the early church. The text says he was put to death by the sword. I believe tradition holds he was beheaded, if that's correct. And then similarly with John, if you go to Revelation, we find out he's exiled to the island of Patmos. And also tradition holds, it's not in the Bible, but tradition holds that John was actually boiled alive in tar and was miraculously allowed to live from that before his banishment. So we see here that James and John, like, they don't have it easy, right? So they go through a similar thing that Jesus went through. And I probably would say that by the time came for them to die, at that point, they understood what Jesus meant by those sayings there. Right. And so, I think, right, if you saw your friends trying to get buddy-buddy with Jesus, you're not going to appreciate that too much, which causes Jesus to correct them. And again, guys, we talked about this a couple weeks ago. We come back to this idea that we are to be servants, right? And again, contextualizing it in one of my favorite chapters, right? This is what Jesus truly came to do, guys, right? In John chapter 13, 12 through 14. So when he had washed their feet, taken his garments, and sat down again, he said to them, do you know what I've done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you say, well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet, right? We're to be servants. And so the disputes like these, Jesus kind of doesn't want to have any part of it. The last thing I just want to touch very briefly on, right, we see in verse 45, great verse, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. That ransom is being paid to God, you guys. This commentary from John MacArthur was not paid to Satan, as some erroneous theories of the atonement teach. Satan is presented in Scripture as a foe to be defeated, not a ruler to be placated. The ransom price was paid to God to satisfy his justice and holy wrath against sin. So I thought that was just worthy to call out. And the final thing, guys, before we wrap up and go into our small groups, we have another really awesome miracle here, healing of the blind man / men. This is actually the same parable as in Matthew chapter 20, verse 30. Matthew references 2. Typically, I believe the other time this happened was one of the demon-possessed men chapters, where there's actually some Gospels have 2, others only talk about 1. When this happens in the Gospel to reconcile them, basically the one who's speaking for the 2 is referenced, right? So here Bartimaeus is the one who's speaking for the 2 blind men in this scenario. Funny enough, even though they were both blind, I like this point I made here, both of these men recognized Jesus as Messiah, potentially in a more accurate way than the disciples who could literally see, right? Their confession, Son of David, have mercy on me, right? Son of David is a messianic reference, right? Jesus calls himself that more times than anybody else, and that's his favorite term for himself because that's a reference back to Daniel, actually prophesying of his coming. A couple points I think that we could take away from this. One, being in a place of desperation causes us to act passionately towards Jesus' calling. I love the language, like, right? We see, I think it's in verse 50, right? They throw aside their garments, right? They don't just get up, kind of kick it and say, all right, I guess, stroll over to Jesus. No, they throw their stuff, right? Because they're so desperate for Jesus here. And I think that's a beautiful representation of kind of when we get into those points in life, like the desperation that we respond with. I think Jesus appreciates that. Secondly, Jesus does this all the time, and I love it. He always asks questions. He's omniscient, right? He knows the answer here. But God knows our needs at all times. In Matthew chapter 6, verse 8, you can see that. But petitioning him in prayer is actually meant to change our hearts. Right? Good cross-reference there. You guys could take a look at Philippians 4, 6 through 7. But that's something I've kind of been meditating on recently, is that prayer is really meant, guys, to influence the posture of our hearts. Right? God knows what we need. But going to him in prayer and petitioning him right? It draws us near and closer to him, even though he knows what we want. And finally, faith in Jesus is what brings a true healing, right? I love this kind of commentary John MacArthur has here. Bartimaeus' spiritual and physical eyes were likely open at the same time. The outward healing reflected the inner wellness of salvation. I also love the fact the chapter ends at, it says, then Jesus said, go your way, your faith has made you well. Immediately he received his sight and what? Follow Jesus, right? So he actually, the change was legitimate as far as we can see in the text, right? Whew, there's a lot of talking. We good? Yeah, so all right, cool.